So what I kind of want to talk to you today about is taking us outside of the United States, particularly into certain conservative Muslim environments where you have actually a rich vein of all sorts of weirdness, woo, and pseudoscience if you happen to be interested in that sort of thing like I am. And just to sort of give a quick sample of what skeptics might be interested in typically, I did this very scientific methodology of looking at some recent Skeptical Inquirer covers, so we can quickly find out that we're often interested in things like creationism in education. We're worried about the status of evolution in the United States, that people don't accept this, often for religious reasons. And then another thing that we care much about these days is conspiracy theories. And particularly the way that conspiracy thinking in these last years have really taken hold of in the media and has come to a degree where it's affecting politics in the United States. And of course, another thing we worry about fairly often is that alternative medicine is not just something today that's out there as a province of cranks and so forth. It's actually finding a place for itself in mainstream institutions, hospitals and medical schools in the United States. So these are things that skeptics we often worry about. So let me then take you now to outside of the United States and looking at these things again. And the example I'm going to concentrate most on is Turkey. Because my personal background is such that I've spent a good deal of my life both in Turkey and in the United States. Half my family is in Turkey, half my family is in the United States. So I've sort of gone through life comparing the two countries sort of automatically, and let me do a little bit of that for you. First of all, if you've looked at news about evolution from Turkey these days, the current outrage for skeptics is that evolution has been removed from the secondary school curriculum. And you even have international cartoons like the current president of Turkey crossing out evolution from the curriculum. And this is sort of the latest action on the part of science education of a government that's been in power for 15 years right now in Turkey. It's a moderate Islamist government, and it's always been cool towards evolution. And indeed, this taking out evolution from the curriculum in Turkey is part of a more general process of desecularizing education in Turkey. And indeed, if you look on the internet, you will find lots of conservative Muslims in Turkey celebrating evolution being removed from the curriculum. This little meme translates as, "This decision is going to discomfort those who have monkeys for an ancestor." And there's also actually a fairly long history of creationism in Turkey. If this was the year 2009, I would have been showing you this particular picture. That was the sort of internationally known skeptical outrage of the day. This is a magazine that in Turkey is put out by the Turkish equivalent to the National Science Foundation. It's meant to be a popular science magazine for a popular audience. And of course, in 2009, with Darwin's birthday, they decided that you need Darwin on the cover. And then people from up high intervened, and they scratched the Darwin cover, and they wanted to put in a less controversial topic, so they put in global warming instead. That's how Turkey works. And as I said, there's a long history of this sort of thing, because when you first sort of saw Turkey having some creationism surface up, it was really in the 1970s with, at that point, a fairly small Islamist party driving this thing in parliament. It was part of a sort of a culture war theme and part of the sort of passive resistance that the majority population in Turkey has always shown towards evolution. Things really got in gear with creationism in Turkey in the 1980s, where the Ministry of Education officially had translated material from the Institute for Creation Research in California. And by the time you got to the 1990s, depending on which government was in power, you started having creationism appear in secondary school textbooks, something that's never happened, say, in the United States. And so really the story of creationism in Turkey over the last 50 years has been a gradual ratcheting up of creationism, and right now the rejection of evolution in Turkey has been kind of institutionalized. But I don't want to give you the impression that creationism in Turkey is purely a matter of what government is in power, that this is a matter of official institutions and so forth. Turkey is actually fairly interesting for a kind of a freelance private sector creationism as well. So for example, if you were to sort of go Googling around and trying to find out some information about Islamic creationism, there's a very good chance that you're going to run into material produced by the Harun Yahya operation, which is a really rather bizarre, cultish, interestingly business-oriented, very media-savvy operation. And it's entirely private sector. It doesn't really have much in the way of government connections and so forth. And it really has been wildly successful. For 20 years, it's almost been dominating the media environment in Turkey when it comes to matters of creation and evolution. And its figurehead is this guy called Adnan Oktar. And the reason I'm putting this picture up here is that you see that he's really trying to project this very modern image of really a sort of a businessman, somebody who's successful in the modern world and at the same time is a conservative Muslim and a creationist. And I could go on with these examples, and from beyond Turkey as well. Essentially, there's a very broad-based Muslim resistance to evolution that is worldwide right now. Okay, so that's a sort of creation evolution scene. Let me throw you some examples of some conspiracy theorizing from conservative Muslim environments. And again, if any of you is a little bit familiar with this sort of thing, probably you've run into more of the Arab version of conspiracy thinking, particularly because it's become famous for its anti-Semitic qualities. The fact that a lot of Arab conspiracy theories have resurrected really age-old images of the protocols of the elders of Zion and everything like that is actually taken seriously in many Arab countries. Maybe even more interestingly, what you might not know much about is that this is part of a revival of a rather apocalyptic way of thinking in the Muslim world, which actually historically has been fairly rare. Muslims typically don't go in much for the end of the world is nigh sort of stuff, unlike Christians. But there's been a revival of this sort of thinking, particularly in the Arab world, and this sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy thinking actually most often surfaces in that context. And I'll occasionally during this talk throw in a couple of book recommendations. And if you're interested in learning more about this book, Apocalypse in Islam by Jean-Pierre Filiu is actually a very good source for this. And you'll find very nice pictures like the weird stuff over there. But it goes beyond the sort of apocalyptic and anti-Semitic sort of conspiracy thinking. Actually, conspiracy thinking is pervasive in the Middle East in the way of thinking about politics. Indeed, if you're in the Middle East, chances are you're going to see conspiracies everywhere. One particularly interesting example is this guy's the same guy, Adnan Oktar, who is the leading private sector creationist in Turkey. One of his other interesting themes that drives skeptics up the wall is that he's very much into Masonic conspiracy theories. So he's seen Masons under every rock, which again is something that you would expect to see if you were doing history and you were looking at early 20th century or late 19th century Catholic countries in Europe. There was all sorts of Masonic conspiracy theories going on, but right now this is a sort of modern-day Middle East. Moreover, the conspiracy thinking in the Middle East is not just a religious thing. I find out that when I'm talking to even secular Turks, very often they take it for granted that, say, 9/11 was a conspiracy because, well, it's just got to be. The sort of typical conspiracy reasoning, well, who benefits from this? And immediately, therefore, there has to be a plot behind it. Now, and you really get weird about it. And this is actually something I pulled from something about Jewish conspiracies and so forth from an entirely secular Turkish site. It's not even religious. But actually, I have to be a little bit sympathetic almost sometimes even to my friends in the Middle East because this is the Middle East. Actually, everybody does plot, politically speaking, all the time. I mean, the place actually is full of real conspiracies. And one of the reasons for that is that Middle Eastern politics is often characterized with a sort of by a lack of trust in institutions, political parties, leaders, and everything like that. There's a lot of secrecy going on in the operations of politics. And you really, in the Middle East, you don't very often have real political parties. The political parties that show up in Middle Eastern countries are often just sort of leader cults, and which also sort of feeds into the sort of conspiracy mentality. And on top of everything else, every now and then there's a real conspiracy that happens, which This example over here is interesting. In Turkey, just last summer, in 2016, there was a coup attempt against the Islamist government from an Islamist sort of a semi-secret sect that was working in partnership with the government for many years. They'd infiltrated many of the institutions of the state, and in 2016 they actually were deeply involved in plotting a coup against the government. And now this sort of weird thing with the hands and everything like that with the Gülenist, this was discovered in one of their secret rooms, and there were also, apparently there were all sorts of rituals where you had to pledge allegiance to this religious leader, and everything was operated in secrecy and everything like that. And curiously enough, this religious leader, Fethullah Gülen, he lives in the United States. He's lived in the United States for decades right now. Right now, the conspiracy theories in Turkey are sort of going into overdrive, talking about the sort of American connections to the coup attempt in 2016 and everything like that. And right now, everything is so shrouded in secrecy, and you really don't know what's going on. So all people can talk about is the possibility of conspiracies, because that's all they can have to go on. Okay, so much for the conspiracies. Let me move on to another one of our favorite topics. Alternative medicine, particularly alternative medicine that has some connection to traditional, what they call traditional modalities of healing. For example, cupping. Cupping has been a sort of traditional way of doing medicine in the Middle East for many, many centuries. And today, cupping has been sort of institutionalized in Turkey. You can go to a medical institution, and people dressed in latex gloves and hospital wear and everything like that, but with a properly conservative headscarf, will apply cupping to you with technological methods rather than something from a couple of hundred years ago. Indeed, starting with 2014, the Turkish government issued some regulations for how alternative medicine like cupping was going to be performed in institutions in Turkey. Also, here's another interesting thing. You can, if you want leech therapy and everything like that, you can get very nicely in Turkey. This is from an advertisement I pulled off the internet, where they're really just literally selling leeches. I'm actually more used to see this today when I go, for example, a few years ago, I was in a marketplace in a provincial town, and I was interested to find this sort of bucket in the middle of the marketplace, and there was little black things floating around. And I looked at it closely, and oh, it was a bunch of leeches they were selling for medical reasons. And it's actually quite popular. And again, but there's a wider context to this whole thing which I want to bring out. There's an institutional context to this whole thing. Because sort of like education, there's a process of Islamizing institutions, and therefore Islamizing of healthcare in Turkey. This particular news story picture I pulled out, when I translated it, says that this is using the Quran, Quran readings for therapy for schizophrenia patients. And this is happening in a state hospital in the middle of Ankara, the capital city. And things like this are becoming increasingly common. There's very much an Islamization of institutions going on. One of the themes that people who defend these things really emphasize is the supposed authenticity of these traditional alternative methods of healing. They're supposed to be more authentically Islamic, more authentically Turkish and so forth, rather than all this sort of imported Western stuff. But there's another sub-theme over here too. The Turkish government has a bit of religious fundamentalism about it, yes, but as much as that, they're also market fundamentalists. So another way of arguing for allowing alternative medicine in state and private institutions all over the place is to say, well, this is just deregulation. Let the market decide. Obviously, there's a huge market for alternative medicine out there. People are demanding this thing. Give the people what they want. And of course, often what I find, say for example, when I talk to my students, when I regularly teach a sort of a science and pseudoscience type of class, alternative medicine is often very attractive to my students, not so much because of its accomplishments and so forth, because of the philosophy attached to alternative medicine. And this is very much true in Turkey as well. Indeed, across the Islamic world, very often you will have Islamist intellectuals equating Western medicine with this notion of a soulless, mechanistic reductionism, and the idea is if we go back to the old ways, which were more closely linked to religion and spirituality, we're going to be doing better. This is actually from a Turkish version of a BBC program originally, and this woman is explaining that the main problem of modern medicine is that it's based on a lie completely. Or here's another, one of my favorite Islamist intellectuals, very influential in Turkey actually, though he's actually in jail right now, curiously enough, because he was involved with this Gülenist movement who's been suspected of trying to overthrow the government. It gets complicated. But he's very much into defending alternative medicine and so forth too, again, by equating Western medicine with this sort of soulless reductionism and so forth. And so due to this religious philosophy, the sort of general climate of religious revival that really has dominated my generation, and the media, the alternative medicine becomes very plausible to many people in Turkey right now. Okay, so fine. Why do we care about, say, what's happening in countries like Turkey and the United States then? I mean, other than to say, of course, if we're inclined to complain about the woo scene in the United States, you can, of course, point out that there are places in the world where the woo scene is even deeper. But as skeptics, we've long had an intellectual interest in seeing how pseudoscience plays out in the global scene as well. I've been a subscriber to Skeptical Inquirer ever since I started graduate school in the late 80s. And one of the things I remember was that there was this big China trip of what was Psychop at the time with Paul Kurtz and everything like that. And they came back reporting about all of these practices in China with acupuncture and Qigong and everything like that. And over the years, the Skeptical Inquirer has continually revisited China and looked at the scene over there. The Skeptical Inquirer also has looked at places like Russia with pseudoscience, places in Africa and so forth. And interestingly enough, there's a certain common themes that appear when skeptics look at woo around the world. One is that cultural authenticity is often very much a selling point for certain practices. Like acupuncture in China was cheap and looked authentic, so they could easily sort of stick that into their healthcare system. There are certain things about, there are certain kinds of pseudosciences which tend to have a universal appeal, but others don't, and nobody quite has really explored entirely the reasons why. And very often, the media is very much implicated in spreading these ideas. And if you want to look at what's happening in particular places more systematically, I'll again throw a couple of book recommendations out there. This is, again, something that's global. I'm giving you examples from Muslim environments right now, but if I knew more about it, I could have done, say, conservative Hindu nationalist examples as well. And if you can find anything by Mirananda, that's a very good thing to read if you want to learn about how pseudoscience and anti-scientific ideas have been institutionalized in India today as part of the politically dominant Hindu nationalism. I have a book myself out about the more Islamic pseudoscience. And well, what really ties in to us as skeptics, what's most interesting about this is the question, really, why woo? I mean, one of the things we, of course, want to do is debunk this stuff, especially the crazier stuff, but we're really also interested in explaining woo, not just the debunking aspect of things. And when you try and explain why woo is popular, you also have to ask the question, the particular explanations we bring out to this sort of thing, are they really universal? So whatever explanations we offer for what's happening in the United States, it becomes a really good test case to try and see if the same kind of explanations will apply in different countries in different situations entirely. And so, for example, one of the things that we often do as skeptics is try and look for explanations for why people believe in weird things. We look at human nature, sort of psychological characteristics of, say, normal human brains. And this actually very interestingly ties into some very interesting scientific work in the past couple of decades of trying to explain religious and paranormal beliefs in an evolutionary context. And you can find out a lot of that occasionally, especially in the science and religion issues of Skeptical Inquirer. And again, if I throw in a book recommendation, Pascal Boyer, his books are a very interesting way to start exploring these questions. And these actually, to a large degree, apply to something like the Turkish example too. Because when you consider it, the Turkish examples that I showed you were really only very superficially Islamic. I didn't have to spend any time explaining to you anything about sort of a Muslim cultural context or showing you quotations from the Quran or anything like that. When I showed you alt-med and cupping, you immediately knew what it was. When I showed you conspiracy theories, you knew exactly what they were all about. And creationism, of course, is quite familiar to us from here in the United States, as well as Muslim backgrounds. So many of these types of explanations actually do quite well in contexts other than the United States. But of course, there's more to it. We don't just, as skeptics, explain woo by features of human psychology. We very often worry, it's a common skeptical theme, is worry about failure of education. So we very often think that to address woo, what we have to do is address inadequacies in science education. There's this idea that if we could really get people to do critical thinking a little bit better, maybe there's going to be less of this crazy stuff out there. That's probably a bit of a naive assumption, by the way. But if you want to do criticism of science education, Turkey, the Middle East, you'll find plenty to work upon. Say, for example, I throw a couple of pictures up here about education in Turkey today. The lower picture is kind of an advertisement for a private school where you have this sort of it's rather weird that they use this advertisement because it looks very sort of multicultural, except that everybody is in Islamic dress. But this is not the sort of typical Muslim dress that they have in Turkey. I think they just stole this from the internet and used this as one of their advertisements. So I feel no compunction for stealing that myself. But the one on the top is actually maybe a bit more interesting. This is for a Science Expo #7. That's going to appear in a major industrial city in Turkey next year. And it's talking about the technologies of tomorrow. And interestingly enough, this shows you something about the way of thinking about science in Turkey right now. Science in Turkey is very often seen by the government, as well as most everybody, as kind of an adjunct to technology, as part of the infrastructure of technology, but not something that's culturally significant in its own right. So really, when people say science, people can be very enthusiastic about science in conservative Muslim environment, but what they mean by science is really technology. And all of this is happening, again, in an institutional context where institutions are increasingly captured by religious politics and corporate interests, very much tied together. So as part of this taking over institutions, what has happened in Turkey over the past few decades, as I've been watching, is that there has been a lot of distrust, popular distrust sown in the public environment that goes towards a way of delegitimizing secular expertise. And so instead of people from normal academic environments appearing and talking heads on TV, there's been an effort to replace that with people with proper Islamic backgrounds. And this also ties in with the increasing corporatization and Islamization of the academic environment in Turkey as well. So very often the way things have proceeded has been to institute at first alternative parallel institutions to secular institutions, and then later on taking over politically secular institutions as well. So this really brings us to questions like this. What is education for? Now, if you're going to ask someone like me, I teach physics at a liberal arts university in the Midwest, and if you ask me what education was for, I'm probably going to mumble to you something about, well, I want education to open minds, and I want my students to appreciate proper expertise, including scientific expertise. And really, overall, if you think about it, what I'm really going for with liberal education is to kind of make liberal citizens, not necessarily exactly in a political sense, but let's face it, very often that happens as well. And in the United States, there's plenty of conservative opposition to this idea of liberal education. For example, in this cartoon, you have a guy saying, this fall I'm going to trade school to be a welder, and there's this snotty sort of university upper-class guy saying, loser, thinking in the background. But of course, then the starting salary upon graduation of the welder is going to be $50,000, but the starting salary upon graduation of a pricey four-year school with a liberal arts degree is $25,000 if he's lucky. So there's plenty of conservative opposition to the ideals of liberal education, to open minds and so on and so forth. And there's an interesting sort of reduction of everything to money over there. So this ideal of education is competing with perhaps more popular conservative ideal that education is about installing the appropriate loyalties, especially at an early age, and then especially later on, developing human capital, So you make $50,000 when you start rather than $25,000. And really to make a conservative people. So there's actually a fairly deep political clash here when you're talking about different ideals about what education is for. And of course, on my side, we have our own sort of stereotypes about the sort of more conservative ideal for education. We often see this as indoctrination, so that when education makes inroads, say for example in Texas, we start thinking of this as, say, textbooks being treated like the Bible and so on and so forth. And of course, both of these cartoons are really trading on stereotypes. They don't really address the real richness of the competing political philosophies over here, but that's how it goes. So let me... Then we often complain also as skeptics about the media. There's a lot of misinformation being spread by the media, particularly because paranormal items are very attention-grabbing, they get eyeballs, and they're cheap to produce. Much the same is true in Turkey, especially if you're talking about UFO, New Age types of beliefs, which are actually not at all indigenous to Turkey. A lot of these have spread quite effectively in Turkey over the past couple of decades with the advent of television in the 1970s in Turkey. So you'll very often get UFO news and things like that in Turkish media, and it's really entirely a media phenomenon. And there too, if you ask what's going on structurally with the media, if you look at Turkish media, well, the Turkish media is really not about information, it's about selling soap, just like the US media. And the Turkish media landscape is dominated by just a few media oligopolies who are very close to political power for business reasons, obviously. And they're really all about advertisement. And so you have a media environment in Turkey where there's very little financial incentive to properly inform people, and entertainment tends to dominate. And so therefore then you get the question of, why do we care so much about accuracy about things like woo in the media? And this can be a difficult question to answer. I mean, say for example, if there's some money riding on it, like investment decisions and so forth, you're certainly going to want good information, but you're probably also not going to get this information from the mass media. If you're looking for good information in the mass media, why we care about this, we're probably going to fall back on explanations like, well, if you want proper democratic participation by the citizenry, they should be informed and so forth. And some of the reasons that might be among this crowd is you don't want to annoy skeptics, but of course we're a very small audience, that really doesn't count. But what we're getting at really over here, again, this is a very political question. When you talk about media criticism of all sorts, including skeptical media criticism, all of this is inherently political. So this brings me again to a couple of comments. First of all, one of the things I'm hoping that I've convinced you that this sort of thing is relevant to the US is that examples like Turkey, because we can sort of stand back and look from afar, sometimes can help us see political and social aspects of skepticism that we don't notice because we're really so immersed in our everyday environment. So these examples are useful. Also, I've been talking a lot today about not sort of necessarily classical skeptical themes. I've been talking about culture, I've been talking about institutions, I've been talking about the media. This is the normal territory of the humanities and social sciences. Now, skeptics, historically, we've often had backgrounds in natural sciences. For example, I'm not the only physicist who's talking to you this weekend. And psychology. There have been plenty of psychologists you've seen already and will see. But if we're going to do things properly, we should probably start seeing more people with humanities and social science backgrounds writing about the context for woo in magazines like the Skeptical Inquirer and so forth. And I have a particular interest in the philosophy of science. Again, in skeptical publications, what you will probably start seeing more and more in the future is not people talking about classic questions like the properties of pseudoscience and so forth. You'll have rather unfortunate jargon like epidemiology of representations and so forth. But with any luck, somebody who's writing about this will translate this to a less jargony form. Another couple of comments. Another theme that's been running through my talk has been the politics of everything. Indeed, our questions have been basically about how should we arrange our public institutions. This is a very deeply political question. Now, our usual reaction to political questions is to say, let's try to avoid a politicization of scientific issues. We aspire to neutrality, but really not being neutral. We're really assuming a kind of a secular liberal framework for everything that's framing everything. And right now, our framework is not persuasive. not entirely in the United States, but certainly not in conservative Muslim or Hindu and Christian environments. And this is not because we, as we often tend to say, that they are backward in sense. No, they're as fully modern as anyone. And indeed, I will go ahead and say that this sort of conservative religious politics is not obviously irrational either. We have to be focusing more on the deeper conflicts of interest rather than try and slap labels of irrationality on things. And indeed, there's almost a sort of a conservative universality you start noticing when you look at both the American religious right, the Muslim right in conservative Muslim countries, or the Hindu right and so forth. It tends to, the modern conservatism often is religious, neoliberal, and populist. It's a context for lots of woo, and it's wildly successful. We should be thinking about how we're working in the context of not a secularizing world, but in fact a desecularizing world. The secular liberal position, in fact, has been quite stale, both intellectually and politically in these past generations. So our idea is that religion and politics have to be orthogonal to one another, and science also has to be orthogonal to both of them. They are not really quite persuasive anymore, and we really have to be more aware of this. So I'll stop by throwing in a final book recommendation. That's my latest book, and where I try and address more of these questions in a conservative Islamic context. And the slides of the talk, if you want to take a look at them, are up there. And with any luck, if I see you in the corridors out there and everything like that, I might be able to answer some questions. Thank you.